Namaste, everyone. Welcome to today's session. The title of today's session is The Search for Truth, One Person's Lifelong Attempt. Our guest speaker is Mr. Christopher Crookes. Born in 1957 in England, he has embarked on a diverse journey across continents and cultures throughout his life. His path took a profound turn in 1979 when he met the Radha Swami Sant Charan Singh Grewal and was initiated by him into the Surat Shabd Yog meditation technique. He has since devoted himself to this spiritual lifestyle and practice for over 45 years. His spiritual quest led him on numerous journeys to India, where he met many revered figures such as Mother Teresa, Sai Baba, the Dalai Lama, Guru Ma Anandmurti, among others. Professionally, he retired after a 4-decade career in advertising, publishing, as a typographer, graphic designer. Christopher's current endeavors include the finalization of a book exploring the historical origins of the Radha Swami movement in Agra, a project he has diligently researched for decades. He'll be in conversation with Dr. Ramesh Bijlani today, who is a prolific writer and an inspirational speaker. Once a professor at AIMS, New Delhi, Dr. Bijlani is now a spiritual seeker at Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. Christopher, sir, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so honored and glad to have you on the Yes platform. Dr. Bijlani, thank you so much for sparing your valuable time for all of us. Over to you both, sir.
Thank you, Arunima, and welcome, Christopher. I remember the beautiful conversations we had in Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch recently, and this is yet one more of those conversations, but I'm sure this will be more directed at the public in general who can get something valuable from conversation. You are a remarkable person, and we are grateful that we have you with us. You turned to ancient Indian wisdom at age 20 and have stuck to it while combining with it a beautiful career in publishing and advertising, which is a remarkable feat. And now that you've taken retirement in the conventional sense, I'm sure your spiritual journey will further take on new turns, progress more rapidly, maybe, and at least it will now function under a different set of conditions and circumstances. So I'm sure your life will be of great value to know something about. So let me just start with something which would be very general, and you can share a little more about yourself, something which could not be talked about in a formal introduction, but which would serve as a good starter for this conversation.
Christopher, sir, please unmute yourself.
How's that? Can you hear me?
Perfect, sir. Thank you.
So yes, I thought I'd base my talk on the approach from the perspective of a person coming from the West and then embracing a predominantly Indian philosophy. That might be interesting to viewers because I came from a Christian background. In the 50s and 60s, education in England was very Christian dominated. We used to go to church every Sunday. From the age of 5, you go to Sunday school. Every day at school till the age of 18 started with prayers in the assembly hall with everybody assembled together. So Christianity was a very strong influence on, I think, everybody in that society. And yet so many people of my age, and I think in the century previous to that, there was a new phenomenon of people from the West looking to the East for wisdom and inspiration on the spiritual path. So that might be an interesting way to, an interesting thing to focus on in my talk. Because I think that people from the West, we have a strange dichotomy that we're very much taught that we have to be skeptical and think, and we approach everything from a very empirical perspective. You have to test everything, see whether it's true or not. And yet when it came to religion, there was a difference there. You were expected to be more subservient and worshipful rather than too questioning. A too intellectual approach wasn't really encouraged. And I think that's maybe true for the Indian approach still to spirituality. But yeah, what attracted me to Indian philosophy more than my Christian background was it had so many answers and practical techniques for trying to experience spirituality in your own life. That's something I felt was lacking in my Christian upbringing. But yet once I found an Indian teacher, what was remarkable was then that I found that there's often exactly the same traditions and approaches within the Christian tradition, but not many people know about those. So we had mystics in Europe, people like Mother Teresa, Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich. There were a lot of very spiritual people, St. Francis of Assisi, but they're not really known to the extent that I think spiritual teachers in India are. There's a very different approach, it seems to me, that in India, somebody who has a spiritual realization of their own is much more highly regarded than in the West, where somebody like that is actually regarded, how should I put it, with skepticism and distrust. Does that ring any bell? Does that sound true? Because, for example, you get people now who get cults forming around them, or a sect, if you don't like that term, and become popular. In the West, those people are regarded as being a little bit unhinged. I think sometimes with good cause, because a lot of the people who have got that kind of following in Europe have turned out to be delusional and created dangerous movements. But anyway, that's the basic difference of approach I'm seeing, that in the West, somebody with a personal experience is questioned and maybe distrusted, and in the East, those people are revered and more widely known. So, for example, Teresa of Avila, that was a Catholic saint who had very profound spiritual experiences, and she had to go through a whole process of being interrogated by priests to see if she was being controlled by the devil. So that is a fundamental difference that I'm seeing in a Western and Eastern approach to spirituality. So the quest for truth, that's the nature of this talk, the subject of this talk. So I did think I should maybe discuss what I think truth is. And that's an interesting subject again, because it seems to me that what is said about that is normally in negatives. We describe that in negatives. It's unchanging, it's indescribable, it's unfathomable. And I know in the Vedanta teachings, they have that famous phrase that truth is neti neti. It's not this, it's not that. So it seems to me in my old age now and in retirement, after going through this journey, that it's actually been a journey of peeling the onion, so to speak, where you're actually removing what truth isn't. In the beginning, when you're a novice and you come to this knowing pretty much nothing like I did from the West, I found that I believed a lot of things which I don't believe now. I have a much looser approach. I don't hang on to belief systems. And I've actually left beliefs that I had previously when I started out. How am I doing? Have you got any questions so far, Mr. Ramesh?
Sir, please unmute yourself.
If I remember correctly, you turned vegetarian much before you turned to ancient Indian wisdom.
Yes, okay, let's start on that. Well, okay, I'll tell you what started me on the quest for truth. It happened when I was about 5 years old, because in the West, Father Christmas, Santa Claus, the Christmas festival is very big. It's a very important festival in the year, especially for a child, because you get so many presents. And parents teach their children that there's this person called Santa Claus or Father Christmas who miraculously appears all around the world and gives good children toys. So I was about 5, I think, and my brother, I had an older brother, and he was 2 years older than me. He started to realize, I don't think this is true. I think it's our father who's bringing the presents, our parents. So he told my father, I don't believe that it's Father Christmas. I think it's you, and I'm going to stay up tonight. This was on Christmas Eve. I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm going to see who brings the presents in. And he wanted me to stay up with him because we shared a bedroom. So he kept waking me up saying, are you awake? Come on, keep awake. So around, I don't know, the time must have been about 10:30 or something. My dad opened the door and my brother said, see, it is you. I said it was you. And my dad said, no, I just come to see if Father Christmas has arrived yet. Has he been? And then he crept out. And then we eventually fell asleep. And in the morning we woke up, there were presents. But my brother was, he wanted to know. So he really pressed my father on Christmas Day and said, come on now, tell me the truth. Is there really a Santa Claus or not? No, I think I was too young really for that revelation. But my father said, okay, there isn't really a Father Christmas. It is us. We bring the presents. That was a big revelation for me as a 4 or 5 year old. And Christmas wasn't just presents. The big part of the religious festival is the nativity, the incarnation of Jesus. You know, the 3 wise men and the 3 shepherds and the baby in the manger. So we used to act out the plays in a similar way to, I think, in India, you act out the story of Rama. So yeah, when I realized, okay, that's not true then, there is no Santa Claus. For me, that was connected to the whole Christian mythology also. So then after a few moments, I said, so is there no Jesus then? Is that all a story as well? And my father, to his credit, he said, well, nobody really knows. It was, a long time ago. Nobody really knows if Jesus existed, but I think he did. So then, my little mind was whirring around. Then I realized, is there no God either then? Because the whole thing, Jesus was God's son, supposedly. So if there's no Jesus, is there a God? So then I asked my father that question too. So is there a God? Is that also a made-up story? And again, to my father's credit, he admitted, I don't know, nobody really knows. So that's when I tell people that, they go, "Oh, that's why you're such a skeptic," because I had this formative experience when I was about 5 years old that made me start to question all the things that the whole society instructs you to believe, but has no real basis in empirical fact, shall we say, for one thing. So yeah, I was quite a devoted Christian beside all that as I grew up, although I got into things that all young people do. But at the bottom of it, I did have still a belief in God and the basics of Christianity. And what happened was that I was looking for somebody who could explain all the things that we're taught from a more experiential perspective. And the Christian belief is that Jesus is going to reappear, he's going to reincarnate. So I was expecting that Jesus would come back, but then the Christian belief is you have to be prepared because he's not going to come. Well, in the book of Revelations, it says Jesus will come like a thief in the night, and only the people who are ready will recognize him. So that was a big concern. Would I be able to recognize if a divine being incarnated as a human being? So I think that was a good primer, actually, for looking for a spiritual teacher. So I got quite into the drug scene in my late teens. That was very predominant in the West at that time. I don't know how it is in India, but that is quite a strong aspect of Western society that, for example, alcohol consumption plays a very big part in Western society in a way I don't think it does in India, for example. I mean, even in the Christian ceremony, they drink wine. And all my parents and my friends' parents had big drinks cabinets with all kinds of alcoholic beverages, spirits. And so getting drunk was quite a normal thing. So I think that is an interesting aspect if you want to distinguish between Western and Eastern approaches, that in the West, mind-altering substances are considered normal, whereas in the East, if you really want spiritual realization, you have to avoid those things. So yeah, I got quite into alcohol and even cannabis. And a big turning point for me was I tried to avoid hallucinogenics, but one time after a football match, somebody gave me some dried psilocybin mushrooms. And I decided, okay, I see what all the fuss is about. So I took this hallucinogenic, and I was with other people, but I couldn't maintain a normal conversation because there were so many revelational experiences that were occurring in my own consciousness. So I had to leave everybody else. And I remember it got to a point, it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, where I'd started to understand that I didn't really, this is an interesting contradiction, I started to understand that I didn't understand what I was doing, why I was alive, what was the purpose of the creation and my part in it. I think there's a term for it, it's called existentialist angst. I started to question my own existence and my own approach to existing as a human being, and how insignificant I was in compared to all the great beings and the millions of beings who've died. And it all just seemed very pointless. And that I was also aware at that time, this is when I was about 19, that there was so much suffering in the world. So yeah, they got to a point where going into that kind of rabbit hole of considering the nature of existence, it was just too much. It was making me very disturbed, emotionally disturbed. And it was like being on a roundabout when you're a small child and the bigger children are making it go round very fast, and you're clinging on and you want it to stop, but you have no way of stopping it. It felt like that I was in this existence as a human being, and it was all too much. I just wanted everything to stop. So I remember curling myself up in a fetal position, wrapping myself in my blankets, because I didn't want to see anything, I didn't want to hear anything, I didn't want any sensory perception at all, or any thought. And so I eventually, and this is in the middle of the night, in the morning, about 3 o'clock, so there was total silence. And I did manage to kind of still myself to avoid this existentialist turbulence. And when I got that still, suddenly a car drove past outside my room, and I heard the motor spatially going past, and I had the direct experience that that sound wasn't out there coming in to my awareness through my senses, was actually the reverse, that I was projecting my perceived experience. And that wasn't an intellectual realization, it was a direct experience. And that made me think that actually I'd started to go mad. And so I discussed the next day, I tried to discuss this with people because it kind of transformed, it was a direct experience. So it didn't go away when I came back to normality. I'd seen something that I couldn't unsee, that everything is my own projection. And I had no way of understanding that. So that's when I started, and I'd already seen how my understanding of human life and existence and the whole creation was hopelessly inadequate. And yet I was aware of so much suffering that did make me very disturbed, emotionally disturbed and uncomfortable, so that I couldn't actually interact with other people because everything seemed so pointless suddenly. So then I started to think I've actually gone mad and there was no way of getting out of it. So then I started praying, on a daily basis, that if there is a God, I need your help now because I've lost my moorings. I can't function in the world anymore. It just seems so pointless. I'd done a lot of reading by then. I'd read the Bhagavad Gita. I'd read the New Testament many times. I wasn't really aware of Indians having gurus. But anyway, in that state, that went on for about a month of praying for help. And I've skipped about why I became a vegetarian, but I was a vegetarian in that time. I didn't know anybody who was a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian because I didn't want to be part of the suffering that the meat industry causes to other beings. And I felt very alone in that, you see. So I met somebody at art college. I was at art college then, in the queue to the refectory to get food. And I asked the people if the soup of the day was suitable for vegetarians. And the person behind me in the queue said, "Are you a vegetarian?" I said, "Yeah." "So am I," he said. So we went and sat down because I was pleased to meet another vegetarian. And so then I asked him, "So why are you vegetarian?" And he told me, because he's trying to live a sattvic life, and food has it fits into 3 categories. There's rajasic food, there's sattvic food, and there's tamasic food. And I was like, I had never heard anything like this. So I was like, wow, where are you getting this information from? He said, "Oh, I have a guru and I've read it in a book." So I wanted to read that book because I'd been looking for answers. And so to cut a long story short, he gave me the book. And there was a big description about food and what the categories are, what food is, the tamas guna predominates, and which is best suitable for a spiritual life, the sattvic category. So that's how I got introduced to the Radhaswami teachings through a follower who was also a vegetarian, because that's one of the vows, that you become a vegetarian if you want to be initiated. Is there anything you want to ask so far, Ramesh?
Well, the fact that you started questioning whether there is a Santa Claus, whether there is God, as early as age 5, in terms of the Vedantic wisdom, one would interpret that you had undergone a lot of spiritual evolution in your previous lives. And in this life, you arrived at a very high level of spiritual evolution, and you were destined to go on a personal spiritual quest instead of following any organized conventional religion. So that was sort of, those were early indications. You also made some important points about the contrast between the Indian and the Western approach to religion. You said that in the West, while I mean, in general, reasoning and analytic attitude is encouraged, that is not so in case of religion, where you are expected to just believe what you are told and do what the scripture says. Now, that is something which was relatively new in the West also, in the sense that it was the European Renaissance which made that questioning very prominent. Religion did not undergo a corresponding change, at least not at that pace. Now, so that's what led to science and religion conflicts. In India, we did not have that sort of a conflict because while we also have scriptures, we do not have the same type of unquestioning attitude to scriptures in India. The attitude is more insight based, in the sense that if a person does not believe in the scripture, the person go on a personal individual quest and seek the answers for himself. And if he is able to persist on the path long enough, sincerely enough, seriously enough, eventually he will discover those. And then if he wants to express what he discovers, discovers the highest truth or the absolute reality, if he has those experiences, and then he can put them down in words. And it's believed that the words also may be fed to him from a higher source. So his mind is just translating what comes from a higher source into words. So in other words, he ends up creating a scripture. And that is why no scripture is the last word. And that is the reason also why we have so many scriptures. We have more than 108 Upanishads, which are a record of the spiritual experiences of the seers. Many probably have vanished, but there are more than 100 which are still surviving. And even today, there's no ban on somebody going on a similar spiritual quest and creating yet one more scripture. And in fact, one can say that Sri Aurobindo ended up creating not one, but 3 Upanishads. One in the Sanskrit language, Sri Aurobindo's Upanishad, and 2 in the English language, Savitri and the Life Divine, because they both have his personal spiritual experiences as he saw them. So that is why in India you do not have that sort of a conflict, and the approach to religion is different. And that is also the reason why those who went on independent spiritual quests from other traditions, the Abrahamic traditions, they kept their personal quest under some sort of secrecy. It was shrouded in a lot of secrecy. And as you said, that if it was revealed, those experience was spoken about openly, then it was sometimes thought that perhaps some devil has got hold of this person. So it was not viewed as a spiritual experience, but more as the something which has come from some evil forces. So that is perhaps why, as you said, the spiritual seers in the Christian tradition, or for that matter in the Islamic or the Judaic tradition, are not as well known as those who came from the Indian tradition. Otherwise, it's not that India has a monopoly on people going on a personal spiritual quest, but all the same, more people have gone on that quest because it is encouraged, not looked down upon. It is something which is considered quite normal. So probably larger numbers have gone in it. In fact, Aldous Huxley has done a beautiful job on this by bringing out that, by publishing that book, The Perennial Philosophy. where he has brought together the spiritual experiences of the Indian rishis, the mystics of the Christian and the Judaic traditions, and the Sufis of the Islamic tradition, and shown that the experiences have been remarkably similar in spite of there being a wide gap in terms of the tradition from which they came and the place where they lived and the period in history when they lived. In spite of all these gaps, one can see a remarkable similarity in the spiritual experiences. So what it means is that, in fact, truth is one. And each of these seers has sought the truth. And although they would have experienced it not in exactly the same way, in fact, the mother has said that how is it possible that the infinite can be experienced in only one way? Once it is infinite, the experience can also vary a lot. But all the same, in spite of that, there is a certain common thread that runs through the experiences of all these seers and mystics who have experienced the highest reality as a personal sort of a quest. And as Aldous Huxley says, that if you look at what enabled them to experience the highest truth on their own and not just believe what was there in a scripture, was basically a combination of two things. And that was extreme degrees of self-purification and intense concentration. These were the two basic ingredients of the method that they followed.
Purification and concentration.
Concentration. So these were some of the points that occurred to me. Now, maybe you can continue with your journey after age 20 when you
Okay.
met Sant Charan Singh of Radha Swami Vyas and was initiated by him.
Okay, well, one interesting similarity that I noticed when I read people like Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo is that, and why I relate to them is because they, as I understand it, had very Western education. And so they also had a very similar kind of conditioning, the materialistic, mechanistic view of the universe. And as I understand it, Swami Vivekananda was actually an atheist before he met his guru, Ramakrishna. I don't know, was Sri Aurobindo an atheist for a period?
At least he did not accept the existence of God unconditionally.
Okay.
In fact, one of his famous letters, which he wrote to his wife in 1905, which was after he had read the ancient Indian scriptures in considerable detail. He started going into the ancient Indian scriptures in 1893, immediately after he came from England. And it was, I think, around 1905 that he wrote, or maybe 1902, that he wrote this letter to his wife, in which he said, if there is a God, I want to experience him. And he did experience God eventually in 1907, the unmanifest divine. But then that still probably was not enough. That experience was also not enough to convince him, because when he was in prison in 1908, once again he said, if there is a God, why have been brought here? I was engaged in something noble. I was not engaged in something of personal interest. I was working for the freedom of the country. If there is a God, why has he brought me to prison? And it was there that he finally experienced also the manifest divine. Everything around him as Sri Krishna. And after having a dialogue with Sri Krishna, he discovered the mission of his life. So till then, and that was that's when he was fully convinced that yes, there is a God. He heard the voice of the divine. And then after that, he started obeying that voice. He could identify that voice and obeyed that voice without asking any questions. But till then, he was still questioning.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, that's also been my approach, that even though I became thoroughly convinced in the, what would I call that, the saintlyhood and the much higher kind of spiritual awareness that my teacher, Charan Singh, had, I still had a lot of kind of skepticism to the whole spiritual quest. Now, is this really a realistic inquiry? Or is religion just something that people believe because they're scared of death and the possibility that there is nothing after physical life? And one of the key phrases in my reading that I still kind of hold on to is a saying by a Christian mystic from the 15th century called Meister Eckhart. He was, I think, a very highly spiritualized person, but he was a Christian priest in Germany. And when he gave sermons, it's very clear that he's talking from a personal perception, not just from book learning and preaching the axioms of the Christian faith. There's obviously some insight. It's very clearly a person who's talking about spiritual realities. They're realities for him. And so the Christian church, he became suspect in their eyes. So he was actually excommunicated just before his death because people were publishing his sermons and they became very popular. But he said a very profound thing, in my opinion, from the pulpit one Sunday. He said, if I had to choose between God and truth, I'd choose truth. And then he went on to say, but God is truth. And he quoted from the Bible, God is truth. But I thought that was a very interesting dichotomy, that if you had to choose, which would you choose, your belief in God or your search for truth? And so I decided, yeah, I'm the same. I want truth. I don't want a belief system. I don't want another belief system. When I came to the West, I had to let go of some Christian concepts. But then I also was aware that I'm now reading all this new philosophy based on Samkhya philosophy, which is very new to me. But that also, I understand this is another belief system that I don't yet personally know for certainty. So I'm going to go into it with that kind of awareness. So you don't know this. So don't become dogmatic and fixed in beliefs. I think that's served me well, that kind of loose approach, while still being devoted to the technique. Maybe I should talk about the technique a little bit. Maybe not. So yeah, the search between God and truth, I think that they are the same, but the way you can approach truth can be delusional if you become too fixated in things that you don't know yet from your own experience. And why I think Aurobindo is remarkable, that I feel like he was forced into this realization. He says that by the British kind of granted him enlightenment by forcing him into isolation. So I do think also now this position, the age of 67, when you get this age, you realize, you haven't got long left. Death is a certainty, and it's more and more imminent. Nobody can guarantee they're going to live the next second at any age. But when you get to this age, you realize, okay, there's maybe another 5 or 10, maybe 20 years if I'm lucky. And I've now got an opportunity to kind of really apply the technique and the teachings I've imbibed over these 5 decades and really test them out, because there's less and less distraction if you choose that path. And mostly, I think we get so distracted by other things, like my book, for example. You can get distracted into other pursuits or projects. And I think the primary one, if you do want to really experience truth, is you have to go within inside yourself. That's where truth lies. And that, I hope you agree, that is the perennial truth that is experienced and taught by all the saintly people throughout time. I was interested to hear you say that the fascinating thing about the spiritual quest is that there are so many similarities in so many different continents and so many different types, and from people from different backgrounds. And the difference in those teachings, as I understand it, is because when somebody has experienced truth and they try to explain it to other people, they have to use terminology that those people already have, because it is an indescribable thing. You have to experience it. But how do you give people some indication so they're interested? It's almost like you have to write out a menu and say, okay, this is what's on offer if you do this, this, and this. So I think the differences in, say, Sufism or Vedanta or Christian mysticism is only the way that people who aren't experienced interpret those shared experiences by realized people. So you have people like Muhammad or Moses or Buddha or Jesus. I think that the base of what they're saying is the same truth. That also was for me a very powerful understanding that although I'm not certain that there is such a thing as truth, an ultimate truth, or some kind of awareness after physical death, the fact that so many people throughout time have said that there is, and you can experience it too, is very, very encouraging and inspirational. And now I wanted to explain to you why I sought out after I found my guru, and I did have an epiphany when first time I spoke to him, which did kind of turn me inside out, because I was very skeptical to the devotional approach. The Radhaswami Santmat philosophy they do regard it as guru bhakti. And I did find, coming from my Western background, that devotional approach and worshipful approach to a person, human being, was a little bit idolatrous and distasteful. I thought it was a bit over the top. And I remember the first time I met him, I remember thinking, I'm not going to do all that bowing and all that kind of reverential stuff. And I had my hands in my pockets when I actually met him and he spoke to me. And I get a bit emotional when I remember that, because it kind of takes me back into my headspace. I realized I was so vain, and when you're like 21, you think you know everything. And I had a kind of a blinding awareness of where I was in the grand scheme of things, that I was just a kind of insignificant little grain of sand. And yet I took out so many airs. I had so much self-importance and egotistical concepts of myself. And that kind of got instantly eradicated when he just said 2 words to me. So it was an interesting kind of double whammy that I felt very, not humiliated, but kind of minimized. I realized my insignificance, but at the same time, that awareness was really elevating. So yeah, that's kept me going throughout my whole life, actually, that awareness. It was kind of like a glimpse of the divine. But yes, I got very much into the meditation technique, which is basically based on the concept that anybody, if they do certain things, can realize the divine for themselves. There are certain prerequisites. The main one, as you just said, is purification of the antakaran, the chitta, the mind that's perceiving everything, and concentration of the mind. So in the last 45 years, while I'm trying to engage in practices that try to purify the mind and enable you to concentrate internally, I was, how should I say this? Well, because I'd had that initial experience by meeting my spiritual teacher, I did kind of fall in love with him, and with that heightened awareness that I got by just being with him. So I wanted more of that. It was like a drug, new drug. So I did spend a lot of time coming to India just to be in his company. And I came pretty much every year from 1980 onwards. And then the Punjab closed. He lives in the Punjab near Amritsar. And the Punjab closed in 1980. 1984 because of the assassination of Indira Gandhi and all the fallout from that. So then he started to invite Westerners to come see him in Delhi and Bombay 3 times a year. And then my circumstances were such that I had the opportunity to come to those sessions and stay in India for 6 months of the year. So that's when I used to come and see him in Delhi. And then I'd have to kill time till he went down to Bombay. And then again, I'd have to kill time from like December round to March till he came back to Delhi. So in the intervening period, I was like, what do I do? Because I was very heavily into trying to meditate. So that's when I started going to other ashrams to be in a spiritual community, and also to curious to see what other people were doing, other spiritually inclined people were doing. So that's how I got to see all those other revered people. So I didn't really go with them with the intention to learn anything from them. I felt totally satisfied with the technique I was following, but I also realized, there's a very famous analogy of the blind people feeling the elephant, and they're all saying, oh, the elephant is big and round because one guy's feeling the leg, the other one says, no, it's sharp and pointed because he's feeling the tusk. So people have a small part of the big picture, but they mistakenly assume that's the whole. So I was aware that I should be open to other people's perspectives on this, even though I was satisfied with the technique I had. And that's why I visited other people's ashrams to see what other people were doing. So that's an interesting thing again, because I think that's beneficial from 2 aspects. One is you can see what people are doing that is good and is better than how you're approaching the path, and you can learn from people. And the other aspect is you can actually see what people are doing that doesn't coincide with your understanding, which you think is maybe a bit delusional. So you can learn, I think, in any situation, you can learn, even if the situation is bad, you can go, okay, that's not how I want to approach the spiritual path. I want to be much more open and less bigoted. Because I think I was watching something by the mother the other day, where this is an interesting thing. When I did meet a lot of those people, one of the crucial things for judging if something is genuinely spiritual is that genuinely spiritual people seem to have an ability to make people laugh without saying anything particularly funny. If you relate what was said to somebody else, they go, well, that's not funny. But they can say things that make a lot of people laugh. I think Mother Teresa had that ability. When I first met her, she talked with about 5 of us about how she started her mission in Calcutta, looking after destitute and dying people. And it was an extremely tragic story. But she had us laughing so much, and my jaw was aching. And I saw this thing from the mother where somebody was asking, when you get on the spiritual path, it seems like you're going backwards and you're becoming a worse human being. Why is that? That's also something in my own tradition, that's a common complaint. When you start on the spiritual path, you feel like you're becoming a worse person. And the mother explained it by saying, in the same way that my guru did, that when you start trying to purify yourself, then you realize what a task it is. There's all these impurities that you weren't aware of before. You didn't regard them as impurities. You're actually proud of imperfections. Now you suddenly see, okay, that's not a good thing. So that's quite a heavy subject, but the mother was talking about it and making the audience laugh. So I think that's a very good sign of somebody who's spiritual. They can talk about very serious subjects. They might even be heavy topics, but they do it in a way that is amusing as well as enlightening. I've lost my thread now. I was going to say something, I forgot what it was. You're writing notes. You want to say something? You're on mute. I can't hear you.
Sir, please unmute yourself.
You were talking about many revered figures whom you met in India during your
Mhm,
travels,
mhm.
and how that influenced your own spiritual journey, and what could be of value to others. This experience of having met so many of them.
Okay, well, yeah, that's an interesting thing. I thought, but this has been good that you asked me to give this talk, because it's made me kind of reevaluate my journey a little bit. And I, as my a kind of approach now is that you get much more from being around a spiritual person than you could ever get if you were just following the spiritual path on your own, reading a book. I think that applies to all areas of knowledge. If you try and study an area of human knowledge just by reading books on your own, that's a very hard slog. But if you're around people who know the subject really well, you can progress much quicker. And I think that applies in spades to the spiritual path. That's my personal experience. But then you have the problem of evaluating, well, who is it, an authorized or a genuine spiritual teacher? And so I thought maybe I would talk about that, as I met so many. But then it became aware to me that I don't think there is any real way of evaluating that. What you have is just people who you personally are attracted to. It's in the same way as if you're looking for a life partner. That's in when you're like 18 or 19, that's like a huge project. You got to find somebody you love and you can live with. And there are certain people you're instinctively attracted to without really knowing them very well in the beginning. So what is that based on? Is that based on some kind of intellectual criteria? No, it isn't. And how would you analyze that? And why does one person become attracted to this person and somebody else may be repulsed by them? It's a very personal thing. I think that applies to the spiritual path too. There may be very many teachers who might be quite highly evolved, but some are attracted to one person and not to another. And I don't think there are some kind of rules of thumb, but I don't think you can really intellectualize that too thoroughly. But there were rules of thumb for me. One is that a genuine spiritual teacher wouldn't get a personal benefit out of their teaching. They wouldn't be charging you for one thing. That's a very quick and easy way of discriminating a genuine teacher from somebody who perhaps isn't so genuine. Are they charging for it? The other one I told you, I've already mentioned, was I think genuine spiritual people, they may not make you laugh, although in my experience they often do, but they don't take themselves too seriously. And they make you happy by being with them. Again, that's maybe that could be a very subjective thing, what makes one person happy, but I don't think so. That's the experience I've had around people, which they do have a kind of aura in the same way that you can be with somebody. No, let's say if you're sitting around a fire, you feel warmth in yourself, but you know the actual heat is coming from the fire. I think in the same way in my experience with generally spiritual people, you experience kind of a heightened awareness and love and peace, all those kind of qualities in yourself. You're experiencing them in yourself, but you're aware that that's been kind of inspired by being in the company of a person. Have you anything you want to say on that? I'd be curious on your thoughts, Ramesh.
And one thing on which there is general agreement is that on the spiritual path, we do need a guru. But then when will one find the guru, and who will be whose guru? These are questions which one can debate upon. And there is no sort of definitive answer, I think, which anybody has. Uh, while I mean, different gurus suit different people, it's also believed that the guru has already picked up the disciple, and when the time comes, the guru finds you. Probably both are to some extent true. In my own case, I mean, I can, till the age of about 40, I thought that if I read books on religion and spirituality, and I read a wide variety just for the sake of variety itself, why go on reading the same book over and over again? I felt that they will help me because they'll all tell me something nice, and what I learned from there will help me live an ethically sound life. But I was not really looking for a guru. I felt that if I'm reading all this, that should be enough. You know, the way you said that sometimes you have that approach also in the West, and some of us who grew up with the type of system of education which is more Western in its approach, we grew up with that idea. But then when the time came, I found my guru, and I found that it does make a lot of difference. But then if somebody is sort of doing some sort of a shopping for a guru, I'm not sure whether it's really productive because, as I said, I mean, if it has to happen, it will happen. You are destined to meet. But then all the same, being ordinary mortals, we do try to think both in terms of let me find the guru who is most suitable for me, let me make up my mind well, what, look for some objective criteria. And one of the criteria that you mentioned, that the guru should not be looking for any material benefit from his teachings, that's a very important point. And in fact, one can also expand to say that he should not be also looking for other benefits like name and fame. He should not make any conscious efforts to attract more and more disciples. They should flock to him rather than he making any efforts. One can sort of argue against any of these because he may not be expecting anything, but if material benefits are offered by the disciples, should he accept them? Now, if he accepts them in the spirit that of not being the owner of whatever is offered, but being a trustee, so that he can use it for the right purpose, then again, there's no harm because after all, uh, in spirituality, money is not something which is poisonous. Hmm? Sri Aurobindo, in fact, has called money one of the three major forces in the world. And the only thing is that, like other forces, other similar forces, it is the one which is generally wrongly held and misused, which means it's in the hands of wrong people and it is misused. But all the same, he doesn't say that money is not important. So Mahatma Gandhi, Sri Aurobindo, the mother, they all talked about the concept of trusteeship. In the same way, when it comes to attracting more and more followers, yes, there should be no conscious effort. But at the same time, these days when we have so much of social media, every spiritual teacher is on social media. And that can be looked upon as a sort of a effort at marketing yourself. But then marketing has two aspects. One is to promote yourself as somebody better than others, which is not right. Also to try to project you as something which you actually are not. That is a manipulation. That is also not right. But at the same time, if the effort is only to make people aware that you exist, and so that those for whom you are suitable, they discover you more easily, then probably there's nothing wrong with even those efforts. Which means that these values can keep changing with time. That is why, in the Indian tradition, we also have a concept of Yuga Dharma. That is Dharma, that is what Yuga Dharma. Yuga is the era, the period in history. So Dharma is the sense of right and wrong. So while, I mean, there should be a sense of right and wrong, it is not something rigidly fixed, and it can vary along with many other factors. It can vary also with the period in history that you are living in. So there's that concept of Yoga Dharma. And that is what has made some of these efforts, which may look like marketing, also acceptable. Perhaps they are a part of the Yoga Dharma. In medicine, we have a beautiful example. For example, there was a time when it was thought the first priority was to save life no matter how. But then now that we have so much of artificial life support available, people have started questioning whether that ethical value still holds. Today's Yoga Dharma, when we have so much artificial support available, probably demands something, if not mercy killing, at least coming to a point where consciously you make a choice to let nature have its course, rather than intervene with those devices which will only prolong the beating of the heart and breathing, the two major signs of life, but otherwise for all practical purposes, the person is dead. So prolonging that type of life is not worth it, although the traditional ethics was that prolong life no matter how, keep the person alive. So there is that concept. So things keep changing. But I think still, as in case of choosing a partner, here also I think objective criteria are not that important. It is what you feel within.
Yeah.
What is it that clicks, so to say?
Yeah.
And in case of the guru, I think what clicks is that you should feel at peace in the presence of that person. It's the result of subtle vibrations. And even in case of ordinary people, with some people's company, you are very much at peace and they radiate peace. And you feel that you are able to add to each other's energy. Whereas with some other people, you feel as if your energy is being drained, your muscles start feeling weak. That so, in case of the guru, it should be an extreme degree of peace and a feeling that you are gaining energy, you are feeling stronger, you are feeling uh, completely sort of free of all negativities. You are feeling very secure and protected, so that now you have no worries. You have an extreme sense of security, and you are willing to submit to the guidance of this person without asking questions. So, I mean, when one has that type of a feeling, then I think one knows that. But all this is within you. So, these are not objective criteria which are outside you, these are all within you. So, I think that is what remains most important.
Interesting. How are we doing for time now? Is that I could talk forever with you about these subjects, but how long more should we discuss?
Well, we're not very rigid about time, but at the same time, I think we should now think of winding up. And if there are things which you wanted to say but have not been able to say so far.
Yeah, okay. Then there was one thing I meant to discuss earlier on, which was why I was attracted to Eastern mystical philosophies when there are those mystical philosophies in the Christian tradition, although I didn't know about them until I came across the West. And there was an interesting thing that I noticed. I've got 3 children, and when my first child was on the way, when my wife was pregnant, I suddenly started to notice so many pregnant women around. And first of all, I thought, is there some kind of explosion of pregnancies? And then I realized, oh no, what's happened is that you weren't aware of pregnant women before because that wasn't on your radar. And now that it is on your radar, now you see it. I felt that was the same with the spiritual path. Once I'd met a guru, then I realized there's loads of gurus, especially in India. And if I'd had to find a guru, if I was aware there's loads of gurus, you have to choose one, I think that would have been an impossible task because they're all teaching pretty much the same basic philosophy. But yeah, what I wanted to say was that one of the things that attracted me to my particular branch, and then I understood later on that applies to a lot of Indian mysticism, which isn't in the Western tradition, is there's such an amount of detail in intellectual explanations of the ontology of existence, why we're here, how we got here, how the creation has been created. You have this idea of Purush and Prakriti, and then Mahat, the universal mind, and then the 3 gunas, which manifests as the past, the present, the future, creation, preservation, destruction, birth, life, death. And then you have the 5 tattvas and the 25 Prakritis. There's so much wealth of detail in the basic makeup of the creation that isn't in Western traditions. Nothing like. And you're encouraged to understand that and apply it in your life in a way that in the Christian tradition, that kind of understanding isn't there at all. So for example, like when I'm meditating, I meditate every day, and I try to we make a vow, you meditate for 1/10 of your day every day, so that's 2.5 hours. So in the beginning, that's very hard just to sit still. And in the West, vacancy is kind of abhorred. You don't want to have a vacant mind. Whereas in the East, a mind empty of thoughts is the aim. So there's a very fundamental difference there. So that's why in the Western tradition, there's no explanation. If you want, there are people who meditate, but there's no kind of, well, not that I ever came aware of, explanation of how you do that and what are the obstacles. So one of the obvious obstacles is that when you're trying to sit still, you're either in the past or you're imagining the future. And being here present now is very, very difficult in the beginning. So the explanation of why that is so, based on the structure of mental apparatus, the mind and the three aspects of mind, manas, buddhi, and ahankara, and the gunas operating on that, is a very helpful tool for somebody like me who's very intellectual to understand what you're actually doing and why this is beneficial. I think a lot of people don't really go into that, either in the West or the East. But the fact that it is there, if you need that kind of understanding and explanation, is what attracted me and has kept me kind of pursuing this, because I am very, very aware that I haven't really understood this, even intellectually, very well, even though I've had some experiential awareness of it. So yeah, I still read a lot of the Western, the Indian scriptures. I'm still trying to get to grips with Samkhya philosophy. One of the crucial books for me outside of the Radhaswami literature is the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. I think that's a fantastic book. That I think he expressed it so succinctly as well, that basically what the spiritual path is, he explains in the second verse, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. You have to make the mind waves quiet, cessation of mental waves. And then he goes into what those waves are, the 5 types of vritti, pramana, vipraya, vikalpa, smriti, and nidra. So again, in the West, although they talk about the nature of understanding what is real, epistemology, and there's all these philosophy, there's nothing that's quite so practical in the Western philosophy that I'm aware of that goes into the kind of nature of reality and the thing that's experiencing reality and how to control that and what are you up against. So that might be a way to kind of end this, that there's a wealth of knowledge. I've never really gone into Sri Aurobindo's writings in any depth because I found the size of it was off-putting. Like the Savitri, for example. I looked at that and it was like, wow, that's such a lot of information. And maybe I don't need all that, When it comes down to it, it's very simple. You just have to still your mind. You don't need to know the reasons why and what the obstacles are to actually do that. So I was kind of a bit put off by the size of that. But I've read up a kind of condensations of his teachings. I just did that today again, just to make myself more familiar, to see where our approaches intersect. And I find it very inspiring. Again, that's clearly what I find inspiring is that this is very clearly a person who's realized something for himself. He's not repeating thoughts of other people, which is what I still find in the West. If you go to Christian, knowledgeable Christian people, my feeling is that they're not talking very much in any depth from personal experience. It's more intellectual understanding and faith, which is okay. I'm not knocking that. That's also very good. And it can be useful to hear somebody else's understanding, intellectual understanding. When you read somebody or hear somebody, even better, who seems to be very clearly talking from an experiential point of view, that somehow it has much more impact. Anything to say on that? You're on mute again.
Yes. And that's one basic difference between Indian and Western philosophy. In the West, philosophy is basically intellectual exercise, an intellectual exercise. You start with some questions and then you try to approach the question through the highest reaches of the mind. And the highest tool we have available is reasoning. And then reasoning can be extremely refined and can go pretty far. So you reach more or less the same truths, but through a lot of intellectual excursions. Whereas in the Indian tradition, experience is primary. And after the experience is there, one may stop there, or one may try to fit the experience into a philosophy. But experience remains primary. And then the overall sort of thrust of the spiritual tradition has been how these deeper truths of existence can be brought into everyday life. So the application is always there. So one starts with the experience, one may have a philosophy, but then yoga, which is the practical aspect of all ancient Indian wisdom, is a way of life. And it's a way of life which is based on a certain view of life. And the view of life is a spiritual view of life. And that spiritual view of life is a philosophy which started with spiritual experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, all the religions start from some person having a spiritual experience. All the main religions, you look at all of them, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, whatever.
Yes, but while I'm in the Abrahamic tradition, there is a clear-cut founder, and we start with the spiritual experiences of that founder, who then translates it in different ways to make it intelligible to the people living in that period of history at that particular place and establishes a religion. But in the Indian tradition, there has been no such restriction. I was saying that anybody can go on an independent spiritual quest and come up with his own experiences, and if he wants to express them in terms of a verbal description, he can do that, and if he wants to knit it into a philosophy, he can do that.
One other thing about my approach then, as that's what this discussion is that one thing I became aware of very soon, and that was due to traveling around India and meeting people with other gurus and slightly different approaches, was that it's very easy and maybe even automatic to interpret what you may be experiencing spiritually within the framework of your preconditioning, your conceptual preconditions. A very obvious example of that is that when people do have kind of spiritual visions internally, if they're, okay, I'll give you another example, which may be more clear. There's a thing now called an NDE, a near-death experience. And there are scientists now have written books on the commonality of near-death experience. People have actually died and they leave their body and then they're resuscitated. And one of the commonalities is that they experience personality on the other side, who they recognize according to their religious tradition. So if that person is Christian, they say, I met Jesus. If they're a Muslim, they say, I met Muhammad. If they're Jew, they say, I met Moses. If they're Hindu, they say, I met Krishna, whatever. So that, I think, is clear evidence that when you do start progressing internally, you have to be careful that you aren't projecting onto that experience based on your subliminal belief system. So I think that in my spiritual tradition, the Santmat tradition, we have a lineage of masters. So my guru's guru, he said that spiritual path is impossible without vivek, without discrimination. And his successor also said that spirituality is 100%, no, 99.9% clear thinking. So I think that one thing for me in my spiritual quest is that you have to be very careful that you don't fool yourself, because there's almost like an instinctive tendency to see what you want to see and to project onto what you're experiencing in your belief system, which is why I found the Meister Eckhart quote so useful when he said, if I had to choose, I'd choose truth over God. What I think he meant by that was you have to choose truth over your concepts of God, because until you've experienced that, you only have concepts. And concepts are a valuable climbing frame. I don't think you can do without them, but you have to realize that those conceptual framework that you're using is not the reality. The menu is not the food it describes. The map is not the territory it is describing. That for me is a very fundamental approach, that if you're really in a quest for truth, you have to be aware of your own limitations and your own conditioning that will make you see things a certain way. So you have to be very discerning and very self-aware, which I think is part of that purification process. That's what I was going to say, but when I went around and saw what other people are doing, whenever I went to any kind of spiritual community, there were always certain people who I thought, yeah, that person's really following the spiritual quest in a very sincere and genuine way. And there were always the majority of people perhaps weren't so, what's the word? Discerning. They weren't so aware of their own mental apparatus, which you have to eventually go beyond. So one of the other things, if we're coming near to the end now, one of the other things I listened to the mother again recently because I was interested to hear her voice and see her. There's a lot of, it's one of the amazing things now, there's so much information of a spiritual nature on YouTube. And she was talking about surrender, that in the end, in the final analysis, when you discuss all this stuff intellectually, everybody has to surrender ultimately. Everybody, doesn't matter who you are. And I think that's very true, because the final obstacle is the self, the small self, the egocentric self. That is like the main obstacle between divine realization and just following a spiritual path for egocentric gains. It feels like there's some deep-seated needs in the mind which can be met by being in a spiritual community and having a spiritual philosophy and having a spiritual teacher. I know in the Buddhist tradition, they talk about triple gem. You take refuge in the triple gems of the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma. I interpret that to mean the teacher, the teachings, and the spiritual community. So although that is very beneficial when you're starting out, in fact, it may be imperative, I feel now in my old age that that can be an obstacle if you're too attached to that. You have to rise above all those things. And that requires, to go beyond yourself, that requires ultimately surrender. I thought that was spot on what the mother said. But you have to know what you're doing. I think people surrender in the early stages in a way that's not maybe helpful in a search for truth. But then, if there is a God and there are genuine teachers, I think all that's taken care of. So there's a kind of, again, another kind of double whammy where the individual has to make decisions, has to make choices, life choices, has to pursue the path rigorously with a kind of will. There's some willpower involved, but at the same time, you have to be aware that actually you're not really doing anything. As you said in the beginning of this talk, that I came with some kind of sanskaras from a previous life that made me question God at the age of 4. So yeah, was that in my control? In a way, no, not really. The fact that I met that person in the queue who was also vegetarian and learned about the three gunas and the Swami Guru, was that coincidental? I don't think so. So in a one way, you can kind of let go and trust in the divine. And that's the surrender aspect. And at the same time, though, you have to be quite kind of rigorous. There was a very nice quote I read from Swami Ramakrishna when somebody asked him how that you should approach the spiritual path. And he said you should approach it like an Englishman who runs up the stairs 2 steps at a time while whistling. And I thought that was interesting from an Indian perspective. That's unusual. You know, you don't run up the stairs, not at 2 steps at a time and not whistling. Because English people, we do that all the time. That's a kind of conditioning. So yeah, I thought, okay, that's an interesting way of looking at the approach. You have to actually be rigorous, but you also have to be aware that you're not really doing anything in the ultimate perspective, and have some humility and kind of surrender to the flow as it comes at you. We haven't really talked about karma, but that's another great thing about the Indian philosophy, the explanation of reincarnation and karma, why there's suffering. That was one of the things that really disturbed me, you see, in my state after the magic mushrooms. There's so much suffering and there's no explanation for it in the Western tradition. That's one of the big problems for Christianity. Why does God allow suffering? I mean, there's a whole chapter in the Old Testament, the book of Job, which is all about why does God allow suffering? And then at the end, there is no answer. God just says, were you there when I made the creation? You know, you don't know what you're asking, just be quiet. The Indian philosophy gives you an explanation that's very satisfying, that on some level you are creating your future by your actions now. So yeah, live a good life now, live a pure life, and try and use life to experience truth experientially within your own being, through purifying your mind, as you said, and through inner concentration. And that seems to me a lifelong journey and a very rewarding journey. It gives meaning to life, which is the thing I was lacking. And you get signposts on the way that shows you that you are actually progressing.
These two things, karma and rebirth, they are interrelated. And
Yes.
if one accepts them without asking many questions, they give us explanations for many apparently irrational things that happen in life, why life can be so difficult to understand. But same time, if one starts asking questions, one can raise lots of questions about both these interrelated concepts, karma and rebirth. And because Aurobindo wanted to sort of convince those who will understand only the language of reason, he had to write so much. That was one of the reasons why he had to write so much. So a lot of effort has been spent on rationalizing these concepts in the life divine. That is why his work is so voluminous. Because if one has to understand it, and in such a way that there's very difficult to raise any further questions, then it leads to complexities. And therefore, one has to be ready both for reading all those arguments and digesting the complexity.
Yeah, digesting, that is another crucial thing. That you can do a lot of studying, but ultimately that would be like reading a cooking book and if you're not preparing food and eating it, that's not very useful exercise. I think that's a problem that I've had as quite an intellectual person, that I've done a lot of reading because I was curious to know what everybody's saying about this spiritual path. So I read all the traditions. But at the end of the day, that won't stand in any stead. You have to actually do the practice. and digest it, make it a part of your being. Anything else to add to that? I did write some notes, but I haven't looked at them at all.
Meantime, Arunima may give the audience a chance to ask any questions if they have any.
Yes, sir, thank you. Participants, if anyone has a question or anyone wants to share something, please go ahead. You can drop your message in the chat box. I'll read it out, or you can raise the hand, unmute yourself, please. So we did have a message earlier from Neil, sir. He is not in the session now, but Christopher, sir, he thanked you for your willingness to share and for your generosity of spirit.
It's nice, thank you.
I think we have a session with Neil also himself. No?
Yes, just the next one is his session.
Oh, the next week only.
Yeah.
The next one is Neil. Neil is a psychiatrist by qualification, and he lives in England, I think Birmingham. Lives in Birmingham.
We have a message from Marcelo. Deep gratitude for another great session. If I could ask, I would put the following question. If everything is the truth, the absolute is the truth, the seeker for the truth is the truth, the world is the truth, what's the purpose of the seeking?
Okay. Well, I don't think everything is the truth. There is this concept in Indian philosophy of Maya. So what we're experiencing isn't truth. That's one thing we haven't discussed. What is the definition of truth? And definition, although we said it can only be described in negatives, it is something that is unchanging and permanent. So that's why, as my understanding is in Vedanta, they talk about 4 states of consciousness. So we're aware of 3, and they are not truth because they're not eternal. So we have deep sleep, we have dream state, and we have the waking state. Those are the 3 that all human beings experience. States of conscious awareness, they are changing. We know that. They're not permanent. And so the truth is the 4th state, the Turiya, which literally means 4th. That state most people aren't aware of. And that is the state out of which these 3 impermanent states materialize. So you have to go from one to the other. So to say that everything is truth, why seek? I don't think that's an accurate understanding. Everything that we experience through the senses and intellectually through the mind is impermanent, so therefore isn't truth. But the mind is the kind of link between physical sensory perception and divine perception. It can look either outwards through the senses, or it can look inwards to the divine cause, which is the core of each person's being. So that is why you need to seek truth, because everything that we are experiencing is not truth. It's impermanent, it's constantly changing, and it will constantly change until you realize for yourself that permanent, eternal oneness that is the back of that. That's my answer. What do you think, Ramesh?
Yes, you quite rightly said that what we perceive is, in a sense, the truth, but at the same time, we don't see all of it because of our limitations. And what we see is only a small fraction, an aspect of that highest truth. And to move from there towards a less incomplete perception is what the seeking is for.
That's a good question. It is kind of the ultimate question in a way.
So that was Maslow's question. Why the seeking if everything is that truth with the capital T?
Yeah,
The
good
seeking is
question.
there because we don't see that truth there. Most of the time, we see only a small fraction of it and take it as true.
One question that always came up, I spent a lot of time around my guru. And so in question and answer sessions with Westerners, often the same questions would occur multiple times. And that was why it was interesting to hear that question and answer session with the mother where the same questions were coming up. The example I gave before. But one question was similar to Marcello's question, which was if we were all one with God originally, why did God create the creation? Why did he separate us and then say, right, come try and get back? What was the point? That was a recurring question. And my guru used to say, it's a good question. So when you go back to him, don't forget to ask him. But first of all, try and get back to him. But yeah, when you get back to him, don't forget to ask him. And then he would say with a twinkle in his eye, but who is to ask and from whom? Oh, Marcello's got a second question. It's popping up.
Now he says this is the second question he was going to ask, which you already answered.
Oh.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Bijlani, do we wind up the session now?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher, sir, Dr. Bijlani, for this beautiful, enlightening session. And Christopher, sir, you shared a lot about your journey and such interesting anecdotes from your life. We are so grateful for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I thank the participants as well. And just to inform, the recording of this session and all our Yes Talk sessions are published on our YouTube channel, Yes Spirituality. This is how it is spelled. You can visit the channel to explore content on yoga, education, spirituality, and related subjects also like self-help, psychology, and wellness. Participants, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your valuable time with all of us. We'll close today's session now with a moment of peaceful silence. Namaste.